21. Lola. Lolita. I hear myself crying from a doorway into the sun, with the acoustics of time, dome time, endowing my call and its telltale hoarseness with such a wealth of anxiety, passion and pain that really it would have been instrumental in wrenching open the zipper of her nylon shroud had she been dead. Lolita. In the middle of a trim turf terrace I found her at last. She had run out before I was ready. Oh Lolita. There she was playing with a damned dog, not me. The animal, a terrier of sorts, was losing and snapping up again and adjusting between his jaws a wet little red ball. He took rapid chords with his front paws on the resilient turf, and then would bounce away. I had only wanted to see where she was. I could not swim with my heart in that state, but who cared? And there she was, and there was I, in my robe, and so I stopped calling, but suddenly something in the pattern of her motions, as she dashed this way and that in her Aztec red bathing briefs and bra, struck me. There was an ecstasy, a madness about her frolics that was too much of a glad thing. Even the dog seemed puzzled by the extravagance of her reactions. I put a gentle hand to my chest as I surveyed the situation. The turquoise blue swimming pool some distance behind the lawn was no longer behind that lawn, but within my thorax, and my organs swam in it like excrements in the blue sea water in Nice. One of the bathers had left the pool and, half concealed by the peaked shade of trees, stood quite still, holding the ends of the towel around his neck and following Lolita with his amber eyes. There he stood, in the camouflage of sun and shade, disfigured by them and masked by his own nakedness, his damp black hair or what was left of it, glued to his round head, his little mustache a humid smear, the wool on his chest spread like a symmetrical trophy, his navel pulsating, his hirsute thighs dripping with bright droplets, his tight wet black bathing trunks bloated and bursting with vigor where his great fat bully bag was pulled up and back like a padded shield over his reversed beasthood. And as I looked at his oval nut brown face, it dawned upon me that what I had recognized him by was the reflection of my daughter's countenance, the same beatitude and grimace but made hideous by his maleness. And I also knew that the child, my child, knew he was looking, enjoyed the lechery of his look and was putting on a show of gambol and glee, the vile and beloved slut. As she made for the ball and missed it, she fell on her back, with her obscene young legs madly pedaling in the air. I could sense the musk of her excitement from where I stood, and then I saw, petrified with a kind of sacred disgust, the man close his eyes and bare his small, horribly small and even, teeth as he leaned against a tree in which a multitude of dappled priaps shivered. Immediately afterwards a marvelous transformation took place. He was no longer the satyr but a very good-natured and foolish Swiss cousin, the Gustav Trapp I have mentioned more than once, who used to counteract his sprees. He drank beer with milk, the good swine, by feats of weight lifting, tottering and grunting on a lake beach with his otherwise very complete bathing suit jauntily stripped from one shoulder. This Trapp noticed me from afar and working the towel on his name walked back with false insouciance to the pool. And as if the sun had gone out of the game, Lo slackened and slowly got up, ignoring the ball that the terrier placed before her. Who can say what heartbreaks are caused in a dog by our discontinuing a romp? I started to say something, and then sat down on the grass with a quite monstrous pain in my chest and vomited a torrent of browns and greens that I had never remembered eating. I saw Lolita's eyes, and they seemed to be more calculating than frightened. I heard her saying to a kind lady that her father was having a fit. Then for a long time I lay in a lounge chair swallowing pony upon pony of gin. And next morning I felt strong enough to drive on, which in later years no doctor believed. 22. The two-room cabin we had ordered at Silver Spur Court, Elphinstone, turned out to belong to the glossily browned pine log kind that Lolita used to be so fond of in the days of our carefree first journey. Oh, how different things were now. I am not referring to Trapp or Trapps. After all, well, really. After all, gentlemen, it was becoming abundantly clear that all those identical detectives in prismatically changing cars were figments of my persecution mania, recurrent images based on coincidence and chance resemblance. Sans logiques, crowed the cocky Gallic part of my brain and proceeded to rout the notion of a Lolita Madden salesman or comedy gangster, with stooges, persecuting me, and hoaxing me, and otherwise taking riotous advantage of my strange relations with the law. I remember humming my panic away. I remember evolving even an explanation of the Birdsley telephone call. But if I could dismiss Trap, as I had dismissed my convulsions on the lawn at Champion, I could do nothing with the anguish of knowing Lolita to be so tantalizingly, so miserably unattainable and beloved on the very even of a new era, when my alembics told me she should stop being an infet, stop torturing me. An additional, abominable, and perfectly gratuitous worry was lovingly prepared for me in Elphinstone. Lo had been dull and silent during the last lap, 200 mountainous miles uncontaminated by smoke grey sleuths or zigzagging zanies. She hardly glanced at the famous, oddly shaped, splendidly flushed rock which jutted above the mountains and had been the takeoff for Nirvana on the part of a temperamental showgirl. The town was newly built, or rebuilt, on the flat floor of a 7,000-foot-high valley. It would soon bore low, I hoped, and we would spin on to California, to the Mexican border, to mythical bays, saguaro deserts, fata morganas. Jose Lizarragoa, as you remember, planned to take his Carmen to the Edits Unis. I conjured up a Central American tennis competition in which Dolores Haze and various Californian schoolgirl champions would dazzlingly participate. Goodwill tours on that smiling level eliminate the distinction between passport and sport. Why did I hope we would be happy abroad? A change of environment is the traditional fallacy upon which doomed loves, and lungs, rely. Mrs. Haze, the briskly rouged, blue-eyed widow who ran the motor court, asked me if I were Swiss perchance, because her sister had married a Swiss ski instructor. I was, whereas my daughter happened to be half Irish. I registered, Hayes gave me the key and a tinkling smile, and, still twinkling, showed me where to park the car. Lo crawled out and shivered a little. The luminous evening air was decidedly crisp. Upon entering the cabin, she sat down on a chair at a card table, buried her face in the crook of her arm and said she felt awful. Shamming, I thought, shamming, no doubt, to evade my caresses. I was passionately parched, but she began to whimper in an unusually dreary way when I attempted to fondle her. Lolita ill. Lolita dying. Her skin was scalding hot. I took her temperature, orally, then looked up a scribbled formula I fortunately had in a jotter, and after laboriously reducing the, meaningless to me, degrees Fahrenheit to the intimate centigrade of my childhood, found she had 40.4, which at least made sense. Hysterical little nymphs might, I knew, run up all kinds of temperature even exceeding a fatal count. And I would have given her a sip of hot spiced wine, and 2 aspirins, and kissed the fever away, if, upon an examination of her lovely uvula, one of the gems of her body, I had not seen that it was a burning red. I undressed her. Her breath was bittersweet. Her brown rose tasted of blood. She was shaking from head to toe. She complained of a painful stiffness in the upper vertebrae, and I thought of poliomyelitis as any American parent would. Giving up all hope of intercourse, I wrapped her in a laprobe and carried her into the car. Kind Mrs. Haze in the meantime had alerted the local doctor. "You are lucky it happened here," she said, for not only was Blue the best man in the district, but the Elphinstone hospital was as modern could be, despite its limited capacity. With a heterosexual Rokenig in pursuit, thither I drove, half blinded by a royal sunset on the lowland side and guided by a little old woman, a portable witch, perhaps his daughter, whom Mrs. House had lent me, and whom I was never to see again. Dr. Blue, whose learning, no doubt, was infinitely inferior to his reputation, assured me it was a virus infection, and when I alluded to her comparatively recent flu, curtly said this was another bug. He had 40 such cases on his hands, all of which sounded like the ague of the ancients. I wondered if I should mention, with a casual chuckle, that my 15-year-old daughter had had a minor accident while climbing an awkward fence with her boyfriend, but knowing I was drunk, I decided to withhold the information till later if necessary. To an unsmiling blonde bitch of a secretary I gave my daughter's age as practically 16. While I was not looking, my child was taken away from me. In vain I insisted I be allowed to spend the night on a welcome mat in a corner of their damned hospital. I ran up constructivistic flights of stairs. I tried to trace my darling so as to tell her she had better not babble, especially if she felt as lightheaded as we all did. At one point, I was rather dreadfully rude to a very young and very cheeky nurse with overdeveloped gluteal parts and blazing black eyes of Basque descent, as I learned. Her father was an imported shepherd, a trainer of sheepdogs. Finally, I returned to the car and remained in it for I do not know how many hours, hunched up in the dark, stunned by my new solitude, looking out open-mouthed now at the dimly illumined, very square and low hospital building squatting in the middle of its lawny block, now up at the wash of stars and the jagged silvery ramparts of the Haute Montagne where at the moment Mary's father, lonely Joseph Flore, was dreaming of a Laurent, Lacour, Rolas KCG or seducing a you. Such like fragrant vagabond thoughts have been always a solace to me in times of unusual stress, and only when, despite liberal libations, I felt fairly numbed by the endless night, did I think of driving back to the motel. The old woman had disappeared, and I was not quite sure of my way. Wide gravel roads crisscrossed drowsy rectangular shadows. I made out what looked like the silhouette of gallows on what was probably a school playground, and in another waste-like black there rose in domed silence the pale temple of some local sect. I found the highway at last, and then the motel, where millions of so-called millers, a kind of insect, were swarming around the neon contours of no vacancy, and, when, at 3 a.m., after one of those untimely hot showers which like some mordant only help to fix a man's despair and weariness, I lay on her bed that smelled of chestnuts and roses, and peppermint, and the very delicate, very special French perfume I latterly allowed her to use, I found myself unable to assimilate the simple fact that for the first time in 2 years I was separated from my Lolita. All at once it occurred to me that her illness was somehow the development of a theme, that it had the same taste and tone as the series of linked impressions which had puzzled and tormented me during our journey. I imagined that secret agent, or secret lover, or prankster, or hallucination, or whatever he was, prowling around the hospital, and her aura had hardly warmed her hands, as the pickers of lavender way in the country of my birth, when I found myself trying to get into that dungeon again, knocking upon its green doors, breakfastless, stoolless, in despair. This was Tuesday, and Wednesday or Thursday, splendidly reacting like the darling she was to some serum, sparrow's sperm or dugong's dung, she was much better, and the doctor said that in a couple of days she would be skipping again. Of the 8 times I visited her, the last one alone remained sharply engraved on my mind. It had been a great feat to come, for I felt all hollowed out by the infection that by then was at work on me too. None will know the strain it was to carry that bouquet, that load of love, those books that I had traveled 60 miles to buy, Browning's dramatic works, the history of dancing, clowns, and columbines, the Russian ballet, Flowers of the Rockies, the Theatre Guild anthology, Tennis by Helen Wills, who had won the National Junior Girls Singles at the age of 15. As I was staggering up to the door of my daughter's $13 a day private room, Mary Lore, the beastly young part-time nurse who had taken an unconcealed dislike to me, emerged with a finished breakfast tray, placed it with a quick crash on a chair in the corridor, and, fundament jigging, shot back into the room, probably to warn her poor little Dolores that the tyrannical old father was creeping up on crepe soles, with books and bouquet, the latter I had composed of wildflowers and beautiful leaves gathered with my own gloved hands on a mountain pass at sunrise. I hardly slept at all that fateful week. Feeding my Carmencita well? Idly I glanced at the tray. On a yolk-stained plate there was a crumpled envelope. It had contained something, since one edge was torn, but there was no address on it, nothing at all, save a phony armorial design with Ponderosa Lodge in green letters, Thereupon I performed a chascroise with Mary, who was in the act of bustling out again. Wonderful how fast they move and how little they do, those rumpy young nurses. She glowered at the envelope I had put back, uncrumpled. You better not touch, she said, nodding directionally. Could burn your fingers. Below my dignity to rejoin. All I said was, G. croix cake at 8 unbil not a billedx. Then, entering the sunny room, to Lolita, bonjour, mon petit. Dolores, said Mary Lore, entering with me, past me, though me, the plump whore, and blinking, and starting to fold very rapidly a white flannel blanket as she blinked. Dolores, your pappy thinks you are getting letters from my boyfriend. It's me, smugly tapping herself on the small gilt cross she wore, gets them. And my pappy can parlez-vous as well as yours. She left the room. Dolores, so rosy and russet, lips freshly painted, hair brilliantly brushed, bare arms straightened out on neat coverlet, lay innocently beaming at me or nothing. On the bed table, next to a paper napkin and a pencil, her topaz ring burned in the sun. What gruesome funeral flowers, she said. Thanks all the same. But do you mind very much cutting out the French? It annoys everybody. Back at the usual rush came the ripe young hussy, reeking of urine and garlic, with the desert news, which her fair patient eagerly accepted, ignoring the sumptuously illustrated volumes I had brought. My sister Anne, said Mary, topping information with afterthought, works at the Ponderosa place. Poor Bluebeard. Those brutal brothers. Estates K2 names plus, Ma Carmen? She never had. At the moment I knew my love was as hopeless as ever, and I also knew the two girls were conspirators, plotting in Basque, or Zamfirion, against my hopeless love. I shall go further and say that Lo was playing a double game, since she was also fooling sentimental Mary, whom she had told, I suppose, that she wanted to dwell with her fun-loving young uncle and not with cruel melancholy me. And another nurse whom I never identified, and the village idiot who carted cots and coffins into the elevator, and the idiotic green lovebirds in a cage in the waiting room, all were in the plot, the sordid plot. I suppose Mary thought comedy father Professor Humbert Oldie was interfering with the romance between Dolores and her father substitute, roly-poly Romeo, for you were rather lardy, you know, Rom, despite all that snow and joy juice. My throat hurt. I stood, swallowing, at the window and stared at the mountains, at the romantic rock high up in the smiling plodding sky. My Carmen, I said, I used to call her that sometimes, we shall leave this raw sore town as soon as you get out of bed. Incidentally, I want all my clothes, said the Gadanilla, humping up her knees and turning to another page. Because, really, I continued, there is no point in staying here. There is no point in staying anywhere, said Lolita. I lowered myself into a cretonne chair and, opening the attractive botanical work, attempted, in the fever-humming hush of the room, to identify my flowers. This proved impossible. Presently a musical bell softly sounded somewhere in the passage. I do not think they had more than a dozen patients, 3 or 4 were lunatics, as Lo had cheerfully informed me earlier, in that showplace of a hospital, and the staff had too much leisure. However, likewise for reasons of show, regulations were rigid. It is also true that I kept coming at the wrong hours. Not without a secret flow of dreamy malice. Visionary Mary, next time it will be unbeldame tout and blue floating through Roaring Gulch, plucked me by the sleeve to lead me out. I looked at her hand, it dropped. As I was leaving voluntarily, Dolores Haze reminded me to bring her next morning. She did not remember where the various things she wanted were. Bring me, she cried, out of sight already, door on the move, closed, the new grey suitcase and mother's trunk, but by next morning I was shivering, and boozing, and dying nitty motel bed she had used for just a few minutes, and the best I could do under the circular and dilating circumstances was to send the 2 bags over with the widow's bow, a robust and kindly trucker. I imagined Lo displaying her treasures to Mary. No doubt, I was a little delirious, and on the following day I was still a vibration rather than a solid, for when I looked out the bathroom window at the adjacent lawn, I saw Dolly's beautiful young bicycle propped up there on its support, the graceful front wheel looking away from me, as it always did, and a sparrow perched on the saddle, but it was the landlady's bike, and smiling a little, and shaking my poor head over my fond fancies, I tottered back to my bed, and lay as quiet as a saint, forsooth. While brown Dolores, on a patch of sunny green with sang Chicha reading stories in a movie magazine which was represented by numerous specimens wherever Dolores landed, and there was some great national celebration in town judging by the firecrackers, veritable bombs, that exploded all the time, and at 5 minutes to 2 p.m. I heard the sound of whistling lips nearing the half-opened door of my cabin, and then a thump upon it. It was Big Frank. He remained framed in the open door, one hand on its jamb, leaning forward a little. Howdy. Nurse Laura was on the telephone. She wanted to know was I better and would I come today? At 20 paces Frank used to look a mountain of health, at 5, as now, he was a ruddy mosaic of scars had been blown through a wall overseas, but despite nameless injuries he was able to man a tremendous truck, fish, hunt, drink, and buoyantly dally with roadside ladies. That day, either because it was such a great holiday, or simply because he wanted to divert a sick man, he had taken off the glove he usually wore on his left hand, the one pressing against the side of the door, and revealed to the fascinated sufferer not only an entire lack of fourth and fifth fingers, but also a naked girl, with cinnabar nipples and indigo delta, charmingly tattooed on the back of his crippled hand, its index and middle digit making her legs while his wrist bore her flower-crowned head. Oh, delicious! Reclining against the woodwork, like some sly fairy. I asked him to tell Mary Laura I would stay in bed all day and would get into touch with my daughter sometime tomorrow if I felt probably Polynesian. He noticed the direction of my gaze and made her right hip twitch amorously. Okie dokie, Big Frank sang out, slapped the jam, and whistling, carried my message away, and I went on drinking, and by morning the fever was gone, and although I was as limp as a toad, I put on the purple dressing gown over my maize yellow pajamas, and walked over to the office telephone. Everything was fine. A bright voice informed me that yes, everything was fine. My daughter had checked out the day before, around 2, her uncle, Mr. Gustav, had called for her with a cocker spaniel pup and a smile for everyone, and a black Cadillac, and had paid Dolly's bill in cash, and told them to tell me I should not worry, and keep warm. They were at Grandpa's ranch as agreed. Elphinstone was, and I hope still is, a very cute little town. It was spread like a maquette, you know, with its neat green wool trees and red-roofed houses over the valley floor, and I think I have alluded earlier to its model school and temple and spacious rectangular blocks, some of which were, curiously enough, just unconventional pastures with a mule or a unicorn grazing in the young July morning mist. Very amusing. At one gravel-groaning sharp turn I sideswiped a parked car but said to myself telestically and, telepathically, I hoped, to its gesticulating owner that I would return later. Address Bird School, Bird, New Bird. The gin kept my heart alive but bemazed my brain, and after some lapses and losses common to dream sequences, I found myself in the reception room, trying to beat up the doctor, and roaring at people under chairs, and clamoring for Mary who luckily for her was not there. Rough hands plucked at my dressing gown, ripping off a pocket, and somehow I seemed to have been sitting on a bald brown-headed patient, whom I had mistaken for Dr. Blue, and who eventually stood up, remarking with a preposterous accent, "Now, who is neurotic, I ask?" And then a gaunt unsmiling nurse presented me with 7 beautiful, beautiful books and the exquisitely folded tartan lap robe, and demanded a receipt, and in the sudden silence I became aware of a policeman in the hallway, to whom my fellow motorist was pointing me out, and meekly I signed the very symbolic receipt, thus surrendering my Lolita to all those apes. But what else could I do? One simple and stark thought stood out, and this was, freedom for the moment is everything. One false move and I might have been made to explain a life of crime. So I simulated a coming out of a daze. To my fellow motorist I paid what he thought was fair. To Dr. Blue, who by then was stroking my hand, I spoke in tears of the liquor I bolstered too freely a tricky but not necessarily diseased heart with. To the hospital in general I apologized with a flourish that almost bowled me over, adding however that I was not on particularly good terms with the rest of the Humbert clan. To myself I whispered that I still had my gun, and was still a free man, free to trace the fugitive, free to destroy my brother. 23. 1,000-mile stretch of silk-smooth road separated Casbeam, where, to the best of my belief, the Red Fiend had been scheduled to appear for the first time, and fateful Elphinstone, which we had reached about a week before Independence Day. The journey had taken up most of June, for we had seldom made more than 150 miles per traveling day, spending the rest of the time, up to 5 days in one case, at various stopping places, all of them also prearranged, no doubt. It was that stretch, then, along which the Fiend's spoor should be sought, and to this I devoted myself, after several unmentionable days of dashing up and down the relentlessly radiating roads in the vicinity of Elphinstone. Imagine me, reader, with my shyness, my distaste for any ostentation, my inherent sense of the comme il faut, imagine me masking the frenzy of my grief with a trembling ingratiating smile while devising some casual pretext to flip through the hotel register. Oh, I would say, I am almost positive that I stayed here once. Let me look up the entries for mid-June. No, I see I'm wrong after all. What a very quaint name for a hometown, Cottaghan. Thanks very much. Or, I had a customer staying here. I mislaid his address. May I? And every once in a while, especially if the operator of the place happened to be a certain type of gloomy male, personal inspection of the books was denied me. I have a memo here, between July 5th and November 18th, when I returned to Beardsley for a few days, I registered, if not actually stayed, at 342 hotels, motels and tourist homes. This figure includes a few registrations between Chestnut and Beardsley, one of which yielded a shadow of the Fiend, N. Petty, Larus, ill. I had to space and time my inquiries carefully so as not to attract undue attention, and there must have been at least 50 places where I merely inquired at the desk, but that was a futile quest, and I preferred building up a foundation of verisimilitude and goodwill by first paying for an unneeded room. My survey showed that of the 300 or so books inspected, at least 20 provided me with a clue. The loitering Fiend had stopped even more often than we, or else he was quite capable of that. He had thrown in additional registrations in order to keep me well furnished with derisive hints. Only in one case had he actually stayed at the same motor court as we, a few paces from Lolita's pillow. In some instances he had taken up quarters in the same or in a neighboring block. Not infrequently he had lain in wait at an intermediate spot between two bespoken points. How vividly I recalled Lolita, just before our departure from Beardsley, prone on the parlor rug, studying tour books and maps, and marking laps and stops with her lipstick. I discovered at once that he had foreseen my investigations and had planted insulting pseudonyms for my special benefit. At the very first motel office I visited, Ponderosa Lodge, his entry, among a dozen obviously human ones, read, Dr. Gratiano Forbson, Mirandola, New York. Its Italian comedy connotations could not fail to strike me, of course. The landlady deigned to inform me that the gentleman had been laid up for 5 days with a bad cold, that he had left his car for repairs in some garage or other, and that he had checked out on the 4th of July. Yes, a girl called Anne Lore had worked formerly at the lodge, but was now married to a grocer in Cedar City. One moonlit night I waylaid white-shoed Mary on a solitary street, an automaton. She was about to shriek, but I managed to humanize her by the simple act of falling on my knees and with pious yelps imploring her to help. She did not know a thing, she swore. Who was this Gratiano Forbson? She seemed to waver. I whipped out $100 bill. She lifted it to the light of the moon. He is your brother, she whispered at last. I plucked the bill out of her moon-cold hand, and spitting out a French curse turned and ran away. This taught me to rely on myself alone. No detective could discover the clues trap attuned to my mind and manner. I could not hope, of course, he would ever leave his correct name and address, but I did hope he might slip on the glaze of his own subtlety, by daring, say, to introduce a richer and more personal shot of color than strictly necessary, or by revealing too much through a qualitative sum of quantitative parts which revealed too little. In one thing he succeeded in thoroughly enmeshing me and my thrashing anguish in his demoniacal game. With infinite skill, he swayed and staggered, and regained an impossible balance, always leaving me with the sportive hope, if I may use such a term in speaking of betrayal, fury, desolation, horror and hate, that he might give himself away next time. He never did, though coming damn close to it. We all admire the spangled acrobat with classical grace meticulously walking his tightrope in the talcum light, but how much rarer art there is in the sagging rope expert wearing scarecrow clothes and impersonating a grotesque drunk. I should know. The clues he left did not establish his identity, but they reflected his personality, or at least a certain homogeneous and striking personality, his genre, his type of humor at its best, at least the tone of his brain, had affinities with my own. He mimed and mocked me. His allusions were definitely highbrow. He was well read. He knew French. He was versed in logodedaly and logomancy. He was an amateur of sex lore. He had a feminine handwriting. He would change his name, but he could not disguise, no matter how he slanted them, his very peculiar T's, W's and L's. Quelquart Island was one of his favorite residences. He did not use a fountain pen, which fact, as any psychoanalyst will tell you, meant that the patient was a repressed undinist. One mercifully hopes there are water nymphs in the Styx. His main trait was his passion for tantalization. Goodness, what a tease the poor fellow was. He challenged my scholarship. I am sufficiently proud of my knowing something to be modest about my not knowing all, and I dare say I missed some elements in that cryptogrammic paper chase. What a shiver of triumph and loathing shook my frail frame when, among the plain innocent names in the hotel recorder, his fiendish conundrum would ejaculate in my face. I noticed that whenever he felt his enigmas were becoming too recondite, even for such a solver as I, he would lure me back with an easy one. Arsène Lupin was obvious to a Frenchman who remembered the detective stories of his youth, and one hardly had to be a colurgent to appreciate the trite poke of a person, Porlock, England. In horrible taste, but basically suggestive of a cultured man, not a policeman, not a common good, not a lewd salesman, were such assumed names as Arthur Rainbow, plainly the travestied author of Le Bateau Bleu. Let me laugh a little too, gentleman, and Maurice Schmetterling, of Loisiver fame, Touché, reader. The silly but funny d'Orgon, Elmira, New York, was familiar, of course, and because I had quite recently tried to interest Lolita in a famous 18th-century play, I welcomed as an old friend Harry Bumper. Sheridan, Wyoming. An ordinary encyclopedia informed me who the peculiar-looking Phineas Quimby, Lebanon, New Hampshire was, and any good Freudian, with a German name and some interest in religious prostitution, should recognize at a glance the implication of Dr. Kitzler, Eric's, Miss. So far so good. That sort of fun was shoddy, but on the whole impersonal and thus innocuous. Among entries that arrested my attention as undoubtable clues per se but baffled me in respect to their finer points, I do not care to mention many, since I feel I am groping in a borderland mist with verbal fandoms turning, perhaps, into living vacationists. Who was Johnny Randall, Ramble, Ohio? Or was he a real person who just happened to write a hand similar to N.S. Ristoff? Cadagla, New York? What was the sting in Cadagla? And what about James Mavor Morrell, Hoxton, England? Aristophanes, Hoax, fine, but what was I missing? There was one strain running through all that pseudonymity which caused me especially painful palpitations when I came across it. Such things as G-Trap, Geneva, New York. Was the sign of treachery on Lolita's part. Aubrey Beardsley, Quelquart Island suggested more lucidly than the garbled telephone message had that the starting point of the affair should be looked for in the East. Lucas Picador, Mary May, Bah. insinuated that my Carmen had betrayed my pathetic endearments to the impostor. Horribly cruel, forsooth, was Will Brown, Dolores, Colorado, the gruesome Harold Haze, Tombstone, Arizona, which at another time would have appealed to my sense of humor, implied a familiarity with the girl's past that in nightmare fashion suggested for a moment that my quarry was an old friend of the family, maybe an old flame of Charlotte's, maybe a redresser of wrongs, Donald Quick's, Sierra Nevada. But the most penetrating bodkin was the anagram-tailed entry in the Register of Chestnut Lodge Dead Hunter, Kane, New Hampshire. The garbled license numbers left by all these persons and organs and morals and traps only told me that motel keepers omit to check if guests' cars are accurately listed. References incompletely or incorrectly indicated to the cars the fiend had hired for short laps between Wace and Elphinstone were of course useless. The license of the initial Aztec was a shimmer of shifting numerals, some transposed, others altered or omitted, but somehow forming interrelated combinations, such as WS 1564 and SH 1616, and Q32888 or CU 88322, which however were so cunningly contrived as to never reveal a common denominator. It occurred to me that after he had turned that convertible over to accomplices at Wace and switched to the stage motor car system, his successors might have been less careful and might have inscribed at some hotel office the archetype of those interrelated figures. But if looking for the fiend along a road I knew he had taken was such a complicated, vague and unprofitable business, what could I expect from any attempt to trace unknown motorists traveling along unknown routes? 24. By the time I reached Beardsley, in the course of the harrowing recapitulation I have now discussed at sufficient length, a complete image had formed in my mind, and through the always risky process of elimination I had reduced this image to the only concrete source that morbid cerebration and torpid memory could give it. Except for the Reverend Rigor Mortis, as the girls called him, and an old gentleman who taught non-obligatory German and Latin, there were no regular male teachers at Beardsley School. But on 2 occasions an art instructor on the Beardsley College faculty had come over to show the schoolgirls magic lantern pictures of French castles and 19th-century paintings. I had wanted to attend those projections and talks, but Dolly, as was her wont, had asked me not to, period. I also remembered that Gaston had referred to that particular lecturer as a brilliant gras but that was all. Memory refused to supply me with the name of the chateau lover. On the day fixed for the execution, I walked through the sleet across the campus to the information desk in Maker Hall, Beardsley College. There I learned that the fellow's name was Riggs, rather like that of the minister, that he was a bachelor, and that in 10 minutes he would issue from the museum where he was having a class. In the passage leading to the auditorium I sat on a marble bench of sorts donated by Cecilia Dalrymple. As I waited there, in the prostatic discomfort, drunk, sleep-starved, with my gun in my fist in my raincoat pocket, it suddenly occurred to me that I was demented and was about to do something stupid. There was not one chance in a million that Albert Riggs, Professor, was hiding my Lolita at his Beardsley home, 24 Pritchard Road. He could not be the villain. It was absolutely preposterous. I was losing my time and my wits. He and she were in California and not here at all. Presently, I noticed a vague commotion behind some white statues, a door not the one I had been staring at opened briskly, and amid a bevy of women students a baldish head and 2 bright brown eyes bobbed, advanced. He was a total stranger to me but insisted we had met at a lawn party at Beardsley School. How was my delightful tennis-playing daughter? He had another class. He would be seeing me. Another attempt at identification was less speedily resolved. Through an advertisement in one of Lowe's magazines I dared to get in touch with a private detective, an ex-pugilist, and merely to give him some idea of the method adopted by the fiend, I acquainted him with the kind of names and addresses I had collected. He demanded a goodish deposit and for 2 years, reader exclamation mark that imbecile busied himself with checking those nonsense data. I had long severed all monetary relations with him when he turned up one day with the triumphant information that an 80-year-old Indian by the name of Bill Brown lived near Dolores, Colorado. 25. This book is about Lolita, and now that I have reached the part which, had I not been forestalled by another internal combustion martyr, might be called Dolores Disparu, there would be little sense in analyzing the 3 empty years that followed. While a few pertinent points have to be marked, the general impression I desire to convey is of a side door crashing open in life's full flight, and a rush of roaring black time drowning with its whipping wind the cry of lone disaster. Singularly enough, I seldom if ever dreamed of Lolita as I remembered her as I saw her constantly and obsessively in my conscious mind during my daymares and insomnias. More precisely, she did haunt my sleep, but she appeared there in strange and ludicrous disguises as Valeria or Charlotte, or a cross between them. That complex ghost would come to me, shedding shift after shift, in an atmosphere of great melancholy and disgust, and would recline in dull invitation on some narrow board or hard settee, with flesh azure like the rubber valve of a soccer ball's bladder. I would bind myself, dentures fractured or hopelessly mislaid, in horrible chambers garnies where I would be entertained at tedious vivisecting parties that generally ended with Charlotte or Valeria weeping in my bleeding arms and being tenderly kissed by my brotherly lips in a dream disorder of auctioneered Viennese brickthorn brack, pity, impotence and the brown wigs of tragic old women who had just been gassed. One day I removed from the car and destroyed an accumulation of teen magazines. You know the sort. Stone Age at heart, up to date, or at least Mycenaean, as to hygiene. A handsome, very ripe actress with huge lashes and a pulpy red underlip, endorsing a shampoo. Ads and fads. Young scholars dote on plenty of pleats cake at 8 loin, tout cela. It is your hostess' duty to provide robes. Unattached details take all the sparkle out of your conversation. All of us have known pickers, one who picks her cuticle at the office party. Unless he is very elderly or very important, a man should remove his gloves before shaking hands with a woman. Invite romance by wearing the exciting new tummy flattener. Trims tums, nips hips. Tristram in movie love. Yes sir. The Joe Romero enigma is making yaps flap. Glamorize yourself quickly and inexpensively. Comics. Bad girl dark hair fat father cigar, good girl red hair handsome Dotham's clipped mustache. Or that repulsive strip with the big gagoon and his wife, a kiddoid nomide. Et moi qui d'offrise mon genie. I recalled the rather charming nonsense verse I used to write her when she was a child. Nonsense, she used to say mockingly, is correct. The squirrel and his squirrel, the rabs and their rabbits have certain obscure and peculiar habits. Male hummingbirds make the most exquisite rockets. The snake when he walks holds his hands in his pockets. Other things of hers were harder to relinquish. Up to the end of 1949, I cherished and adored, and stained with my kisses and merman tears, a pair of old sneakers, a boy's shirt she had worn, some ancient blue jeans I found in the trunk compartment, a crumpled school cap, such like wanton treasures. Then, when I understood my mind was cracking, I collected those sundry belongings, added to them what had been stored in Beardsley a box of books, her bicycle, old coats, galoshes, and on her 15th birthday mailed everything as an anonymous gift to a home for orphaned girls on a windy lake, on the Canadian border. It is just possible that had I gone to a strong hypnotist he might have extracted from me and arrayed in a logical pattern certain chance memories that I have threaded through my book with considerably more ostentation than they present themselves with to my mind even now when I know what to seek in the past. At the time I felt I was merely losing contact with reality, and after spending the rest of the winter and most of the following spring in a Quebec sanatorium where I had stayed before, I resolved first to settle some affairs of mine in New York and then to proceed to California for a thorough search there. Here is something I composed in my retreat. Wanted, Dolores Haze. Hair, brown. Lips, scarlet. Age, 5,300 days. Profession, none. or starlet? Where are you hiding, Dolores Haze? Why are you hiding, darling? I talk in a daze, I walk in a maze, I cannot get out, said this darling. Where are you riding, Dolores Haze? What make is the magic carpet? Is a cream cougar the present craze? And where are you parked, my car pet? Who is your hero, Dolores Haze? Still one of those blue-caped starmen? Oh, the balmy days and the palmy bays, and the cars, and the bars, my Carmen. Oh, Dolores, that jukebox hurts. Are you still dancin', darlin'? Both in worn Levi's, both in torn t-shirts, and I, in my corner, snarlin'. Happy, happy is gnarled McFate touring the states with a child wife, plowing his molly in every state among the protected wildlife. My dolly, my folly. Her eyes were there, and never closed when I kissed her. Know an old perfume called Soleil Vert? Are you from Paris, mister? L'autre soy run air Freud dopera melita, son feel bien fall estate qui sci-fi. Il neige, le décor sacréul, Lolita. Lolita, qui G fata ta vie? Dying, dying, Lolita Haze, of hate and remorse, I'm dying. And again my hairy fist I raise, and again I hear you crying. Officer, officer, there they go in the rain, where that lighted store is. And her socks are white, and I love her so, and her name is Haze, Dolores. Officer, officer, there they are Dolores Haze and her lover. Whip out your gun and follow that car. Now tumble out, and take cover. Wanted, wanted, Dolores Haze. Her dream gray gaze never flinches. 90 pounds is all she weighs with a height of 60 inches. My car is limping, Dolores Haze, and the last long lap is the hardest, and I shall be dumped where the weed decays, and the rest is rust and stardust. By psychoanalyzing this poem, I notice it is really a maniac's masterpiece. The stark, stiff, lurid rhymes correspond very exactly to certain perspectiveless and terrible landscapes and figures, and magnified parts of landscapes and figures, as drawn by psychopaths in tests devised by their astute trainers. I wrote many more poems. I immersed myself in the poetry of others. But not for a second did I forget the load of revenge. I would be a knave to say, and the reader a fool to believe, that the shock of losing Lolita cured me of pederosis. My accursed nature could not change, no matter how my love for her did. On playgrounds and beaches, my sullen and stealthy eye, against my will, still sought out the flash of an nymphet's limbs, the sly tokens of Lolita's handmaids and Rosa girls. But one essential vision in me had withered, never did I dwell now on possibilities of bliss with a little maiden, specific or synthetic, in some out-of-the-way place, never did my fancy sink its fangs into Lolita's sisters, far far away, in the coves of evoked islands. That was all over, for the time being at least. On the other hand, alas, 2 years of monstrous indulgence had left me with certain habits of lust. I feared lest the void I lived in might drive me to plunge into the freedom of sudden insanity when confronted with a chance temptation in some lane between school and supper. Solitude was corrupting me. I needed company and care. My heart was a hysterical, unreliable organ. This is how Rita enters the picture.